Hi, welcome.
Good
Well,
morning, everyone. I'm Dawn Matheny, the executive director of Veriditas, and we're very happy to have you all today. I'm going to turn it over to Ellen, who is chair of the World Labyrinth Day Committee. Veriditas is very happy to be working in partnership with TLS and the Australian Labyrinth Network, um, and the Legacy Labyrinth project. So, Ellen.
Welcome, everybody. So happy that you're here. It's fun to see some familiar faces and some familiar names. If you're not on screen, that's okay. So excited to have our last pre-World Labyrinth Day event. This is the fourth in our series of pre-World Labyrinth Day events. If you missed the other three, please know you can find them on the worldlabyrinthday.org website. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lars and Peter Clark, who's joining us. I'm so excited about this. Peter and I have not met yet, but I just got to listen to a little bit before this started, and he's fantastic. So, Lars, do you want to do the introductions? And
sure, yeah.
then we'll
So,
move to Carmel to do the intention.
okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Ellen. And yeah, I'm Lars Howlett, and I'm a Labyrinth designer, builder, and Veriditas faculty member and staff member. So I wear many hats, but there's nothing I love more than creating labyrinths, and that's really how I began. My work with the labyrinth was drawing them on the beach in Half Moon Bay, California, where I lived. And I met Peter through Facebook and also just through the Labyrinth Maker community because, in some fields, things are very competitive. Like I used to be a photographer and, everyone's competing against each other as photographers. But in labyrinth making, it's very cooperative and very supportive. It's incredible. And so when any maker needs a little help, they email each other. So I think Peter first reached out to me about creating a temporary labyrinth. And then on Facebook, the global group and also the makers forum are two different groups where we post our projects and our ideas and our dreams and challenges. And so Peter really caught my eye there with some of his creative temporary labyrinths. So I'm really happy to have him as a guest from England. So, Peter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much indeed, Lars, and good afternoon, if I may say that, because it's 5 p.m. on the summertime hour for the UK, which is where I am in the north of England. I'm delighted to be talking to you on the other side of the pond and down under or wherever you might be. And thank you, Lars, for inviting me to share some of the experiences of playing with the labyrinths over the last 8-10 years and discovering the opportunities to engage with communities, as well as to create something of a story of the labyrinths where I am at any one time. So I think Lars has got an absolute catalogue of my photographs over the last few years, and he keeps popping them up and reminding me of where I was in Italy or Spain or wherever. And hopefully we can share some of those with you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Peter. And Carmel, would you like to lead us in our intention for the day?
Thank you, Lars. I certainly would. And I just wanted to welcome everyone to this last pre-World Labyrinth Day workshop. Let's create temporary labyrinths for World Labyrinth Day. So before we get started with the program, I think the best thing is to start from within. So I'm going to ask that you join me in a little guided meditation, and then we're going to share what we call the pre-World Labyrinth Day intention. And this intention is to prepare our hearts for the day itself. So what I'm going to ask for you to do is just get into your meditative posture, whether that's closing your eyes, perhaps you need to close off your mic or even your video in order to feel comfortable. Put your feet down on the solid floor, connecting yourself to our beautiful Mother Earth. And let's go ahead and join each other by putting our hands on our hearts. just as a sign of collective solidarity for world peace and planetary healing. So as we breathe in together, taking a few cleansing breaths in, breathing in once nice and deep, just go ahead and blow that out nice and hard, getting rid of all the kerfluffle of the day, anything that is not serving you well in this moment in time. Continue with that breathing as you slow down your thinking, as you open your heart to spaciousness, letting go of body sensations and relaxing into this time and purpose, touching the divine spark within. Continue your slow, deep breathing, feeling the cleansing breath and rhythm of your heartbeat. Let that unify your whole being. With every in-breath, breathe in peace and imagine your World Labyrinth Day walk. Breathe into that day and feel your heart expand with love. Imagine communities coming together on the labyrinth. With every exhale, breathe out love into our world. And let this breath flow into you from your heart. Inhaling peace and exhaling love. Continue your slow breathing as we move into our intention with compassion and kindness as we work together for the highest good of World Labyrinth Day. I will read the intention 3 times. On this first time, I just want you to listen with the ears of your heart. The hearts of the hosts and participants are prepared for World Labyrinth Day. All labyrinths are connected for the highest good of our world. On this second time, I would like for you to repeat it to yourself, whisper it to yourself after me. The hearts of the hosts and participants are prepared for World Labyrinth Day. All labyrinths are connected for the highest good of our world. And on this last and final reading, let it just entrain deeply into your thoughts. We will have this available for you later in the chat, and it can be found on the worldlabyrinthday.org website. The hearts of the hosts and participants are prepared for World Labyrinth Day. All labyrinths are connected for the highest good of our world. May it be so. Amen and namaste. Lars, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Dawn and Carmel and Ellen, for having us here today. It's great to be with you all. Thanks, everyone, for joining us live, and those of you who are watching the recording. I love temporary labyrinths. I mean, I feel like temporary labyrinths are really the most fun to create and to experience, and they have a lot of benefits. They can be simple. They can be fun, low impact, inexpensive. You can really get into an intuitive space in creating them because there's no, fear of, making a mistake because it's impermanent. And often they are surprising in either how you create them or their resonance with people. You really, the most important thing is that you can make them to be site specific. You can create a custom, one of a kind labyrinth for that moment and that space. And there also can be risky. So I wanted to start with a story from myself and from Peter about temporary labyrinths. And this is not a webinar about how to create them. I've done that webinar before, so I have a link, or Dawn maybe can put it in the chat. It's from 2 years ago, it was how to create pop-up labyrinths. And that's, a technique, especially where you can take a spiral and quickly create a spiral and change it into a labyrinth. But there's many different ways to create labyrinths. And if you are interested in the actual, like, how to lay out the design, then there's a webinar and a handout for that. And this today is more about ideas and inspiration and stories of temporary labyrinths, just to kind of get your own creative uh, ideas and projects going. And so I was attending the Labyrinth Society gathering in Florida. And at every gathering, there is temporary labyrinths on the grounds, which is an invitation for people who attend the conference to lay out a labyrinth. And I wanted to create a labyrinth that was reflective of Florida. So I thought, what could I do? A Florida labyrinth. What would a Florida labyrinth look like? What would it look like? And I had this vision of a pink yard flamingo. And I thought, oh my God, I can't make a labyrinth out of pink flamingos. But then I thought, well, what would that look like? And I imagined this flamingo labyrinth. And I thought, oh my God, this is crazy. But let me see, how much does a flamingo cost? Maybe, I don't know, can I buy them and return them? Or, but it's like $8 each. And I would need like 200 of them. And I thought, well, this is just crazy, crazy, crazy. But I was at dinner like the night before the conference with the board members, and I told Jody Lorimer, I said, I have this idea for a flamingo labyrinth. She says, well, here they rent flamingos. And I said, they rent flamingos? And she says, yeah, they have these things called flocking, where if someone's turning 50 years old or they're graduating high school, you can rent a flock of flamingos and prank them by putting them on their yard in the middle of the night, and they wake up and there's like 100 flamingos on their yard. I thought, oh my God. So then I look up, flock flamingo, Delray Beach, Florida. And sure enough, there was a high school that was like 15 minutes away that was renting a flock of flamingos to raise money for their senior class trip. So I said, can I rent a flock of flamingos for this weekend? And they said, sure, yeah. And we include delivery and pickup with the flamingos. I thought, oh my God, okay, well, yeah, bring them on Friday and I'll make a labyrinth. So they brought them, and this was the result, this flamingo labyrinth. So this is a little 3-circuit. The most simple basic labyrinth you can create is a 3-circuit labyrinth. So I had enough flamingos to make this little 3-circuit labyrinth. And it was just amazing, because even when I wasn't at the labyrinth, I could hear if someone was walking it, because I would just hear laughter and like screams and like, not the things you typically expect from a labyrinth, but it was so fun to just hear people in the labyrinth, like just having the time of their lives. So, this wild idea actually was recyclable. It raised money for the local community. It was, one of a kind, something that people will never forget. And it was just, the synchronicity that can happen if you just allow things to kind of, the impossible to become possible. So I felt like that was just such a fun exercise in creating a labyrinth. So Peter, would you like to share a little bit about your work and your community with labyrinths?
Yes, thank you, Lars. Our conversation last week made me realize we actually need a category called the ephemeral labyrinth and the temporary labyrinth, because I think the ephemeral is so important. How many people draw beach labyrinths knowing full well that the duration of their labyrinth is but a matter of hours, and yet they are so potent, especially in summertime on a British beach, because the interaction is phenomenal. And the placing of a labyrinth on a beautiful Yorkshire beach encourages people to participate, as we would say, in the way that they want to. And I think I spent quite a lot of time learning the labyrinths by drawing them. I only live 20 miles from the coast. It's a bit of a hostile place in the winter, But that engagement with labyrinths gave me enormous amount of confidence. I can think big and I can draw big, but the know-how of creating labyrinths was in many ways appreciated more by that act, not just my sketchbook. And then, of course, as Lars had indicated, you have that temporary labyrinth. And I wanted to try and see if I could get a temporary labyrinth somewhere in the community in which I live. And Lars, you surprised me, and I'm delighted that you do, because I'd forgotten this one until you showed it this afternoon. I live 50 yards from this location. It's where the two towns intersect. And I asked John Willie here, who's a local jockey, if he wouldn't mind walking it. And I heard from some people, I heard from my wife that some people were a bit surprised at this, and maybe surprised because they'd never encountered it before. But the idea still persisted. How can I get labyrinths into my community which are non-threatening, are accepted, and yet are, if you like, temporary, because I can't make them permanent? And so it went around and round, and then I hit on the idea of creating a labyrinth with sawdust. And sawdust is easily available, and I persuaded the local authority to allow me to put a labyrinth down. And this is in an area we would call a floodplain. You can see that wall there that protects the town from the river when it floods. And they said, you realize that this area floods? I said, yes, no problem. I just wanted to get labyrinths into the community. And true enough, people walked past and said, I just love your labyrinths. I said, have you tried walking it? No, I'm too busy getting to work, but I love it. And then, of course, the children would come and race their dads, and it started to create a dialogue. One young man said to me, I used it, I broke up with my girlfriend, and I used it, I put tea lights there, and I just had a time of reflection. So I said to the local council, it's for liturgy, it's for recreation, and it's for art. And as you can see, it changes with the seasons. And eventually they accepted the idea that we could make this temporary labyrinth, having past how many years, 4 or 5 years of replenishing it with sawdust. They then took on the idea that it could be made permanent. So we've moved from the temporary to the permanent with the most cost-effective, simple brick line. But I must tell you, this labyrinth, as it was in sawdust, even when it flooded, it didn't disappear. So wow. That was quite a story for the town. And then I continued to do it, laying labyrinths, and later a labyrinth in another area, which was in response to Green Spirit, who wanted a solstice labyrinth for winter solstice. But we also used to do them temporary again for the summer solstice using a rope. And we would find a location where we would see the sunrise, and I would go the day before and lay out a labyrinth. So the summer solstice was celebrated using a labyrinth, and that kind of continued. I think I should stop there, Lars, because you might have some questions.
All right. I love that idea of being in dialogue with the community. And that's really, in creating a labyrinth, you want to kind of consider, you're not making the labyrinth for yourself. You're trying to create a space that's inviting and, resonates with the community, with the, environment, and with the intention of whatever, theme or focus. If you're creating a World Labyrinth Day labyrinth, then, are you creating it for peace? Are you creating it for community building, connection? So those are all good thoughts. So thanks, Peter. So yes, the ephemeral labyrinth. I love that. The whole new category, right? The labyrinth is just created for one day or one moment. This is a labyrinth I created on the beach in Higgins Beach, Maine. And this is the first full 11th Circuit chart labyrinth that I ever created. And as Peter said, I think a great way to practice is on the beach. So if you have a beach or sand, a lake beach or something nearby where you can draw on, it's just like a giant chalkboard in terms of learning how to draw labyrinths. And then instantly somebody will show up and want to walk it, probably even before you're finished. Um, Next to the beach, I think chalk is a great material for creating temporary labyrinths. The thing with chalk, though, is that if you're using the seed pattern, you don't have to erase. So that's a good way to create a classical labyrinth, is using the seed pattern. That way you can just connect the dots. And this is a chalk labyrinth that I created for World Labyrinth Day in 2021. And you can see I like using multiple colors of chalk. So you can, use white maybe to lay out your initial design, but then to go back with another color and add a little bit of vibrancy to the labyrinth, I think is kind of nice. And also it's, with a temporary labyrinth, you can write some words. Like I wrote "The journey is yours," and then I wrote #World Labyrinth Day. Usually with a permanent labyrinth, I wouldn't have writing at the entrance, but I feel like with a temporary or an ephemeral labyrinth, writing is a nice thing to add into the design, especially if you're going to leave it out, maybe not be there, so people know what that labyrinth is for. Flower is another item that you can use for temporary labyrinths. This is a labyrinth I also created at a TLS gathering on Vancouver Island, and it's a Baltic wheel. So it has, oh no, this is the Chakravayu. This is the Chakravayu labyrinth. So it has a spiral center, and then it has a classical exterior. So we created this at sunset and we used luminarias around the perimeter. So you can see there's paper bags filled with sand and candles to outline the perimeter of the labyrinth. And the flower actually catches light really well in the dark. So if you're making an evening or a night labyrinth, flower can really kind of reflect the moonlight, or if there's any street lights around, it makes it a more visible labyrinth for the evening. You can also use field marking paint. So this is paint that's meant to be sprayed upside down. It's a can that they use for, like, sports fields. But the thing with this is that you can't erase, so you can't make any mistakes. You could actually have a can of green paint as well as your can of white paint. And if you did make a mistake, then you could spray paint over it with green, which I've done before. So you can also see I've used some flags here to kind of measure out where my endpoints are, so that I, can come around and make sure that I don't, close my entrance to the labyrinth. Here's a giant Chart labyrinth that we created for Lauren Artris, a workshop on the beach in San Diego. And I did this in collaboration with Kirkos, he's known as Circle Man, and he creates these labyrinths on New Year's Day. And he used colored sand to kind of highlight the rosette and create a mandala in the center. So he added color sand on top of the beach sand. And Lauren brought these scarves for the participants because it was a public space. Maybe if they were having some, deep, personal, reflective, introspective moment, they could use a scarf to kind of create more of a sense of privacy in that situation. In the pandemic, I created this labyrinth in my backyard. It's very small. People often ask, I don't have a lot of room. How can I make a labyrinth if I only have 9 feet of space? Well, these pathways are actually only about 6 inches wide. So, this labyrinth is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's only 6.5 feet wide, and it uses blue painter's tape, and it's square. So one of the methods for creating labyrinths is to create concentric shapes and then to transform the concentric shapes into a labyrinth. And that's how we create the Chart labyrinth too. We use 12 concentric circles, and then we open up the entrance pathways and open up the turns. So to create this labyrinth, first I created 6 concentric squares, and then I opened up the pathways and the turns, and I used the grid of the patio as my graph paper. So if you're working on a patio that has a design in it, you can actually use that as your measurements and you don't even need a ruler. So these stones are either 6 or 12 inches wide, and so I could just use the stones themselves to create the measurements for the labyrinth. It's funny, this is a temporary labyrinth I created with duct tape on a blue tarp. And it was only supposed to be used for like 1 week that I was an artist in residence at an elementary school. So if you wanted to make a quick and dirty canvas labyrinth, I duct taped this onto a blue tarp, but the teacher that I worked with actually kept this labyrinth alive for 10 years. So it surprisingly, she was able to, she had to do some retaping and fixing and maintenance on this because it's not really a durable material, but you know, somehow she was able to do that. So my next favorite material, and really my most favorite material for temporary labyrinths, is masking tape, and that's because you can erase the masking tape by lifting it up. So, for instance, when you're creating the concentric circle labyrinth, here I created the concentric circles with the tape, and then I was just able with a X-Acto knife to cut the tape and pull it up to open up these entrance turns. So if you're going to make a temporary labyrinth on a hard surface, I really like using tape. And just like the chalk, I used two different colors. I used blue and green because this was really meant to be a world kind of centric labyrinth. And I used a tablecloth in the center. This is a 6-foot tablecloth of a print of the Earth, the globe, as seen from a satellite. So I taped this tablecloth to create a focal point in the center, and this is at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago. So I used colors to reflect the Earth. I used an image of the Earth in the center. And then, the Chart Labyrinth isn't the only labyrinth that gets to have the fun of lunations. You can add kind of lunations to other types of labyrinths. And so this is my kind of improvisational lunation for the exterior of this. This is called a triune labyrinth because it's divided into 3 parts instead of into 4. Here's another
I
example.
wonder if we could quickly tell, you talk about spontaneity, what happened around the outside when we were at the Parliament,
Yeah, it is an
what those
interesting
flags were.
story.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, Ellen was there with me, and so I was an artist creating this art installation of the labyrinth, and there was another artist who was creating an art installation reflecting um, youth that had been killed since Sandy Hook. So she created a memorial using these ribbons, orange ribbons, and each ribbon represents someone under the age of 18 who has died by gun violence since Sandy Hook. So it was really intense. I thought, wow, I'm here making this kind of Earth celebration labyrinth, and she has this memorial. And so I had to really like sit with this for a moment and think, how can we share this space? And then I thought, we can use it as a perimeter around the labyrinth, and it can create a container for the labyrinth. And it can also, at this time, there were all the wildfires happening in California. It was still happening, but it kind of, to me, felt like we have the earth and then we have this fire and violence that's happening in our earth. And it made the whole experience of walking this labyrinth, that duality of, honoring and being so uh, appreciative of our earth, but then also thinking about, the chaos and destruction that's surrounding it. So, yeah. This is a labyrinth that I created with, again, different colored masking tape. And you can see, I especially like to use it to kind of set apart the center and the entrance. So here I did the kind of lunation squiggle, but I also added 2 circles to kind of mark the threshold. And then I used the red tape to amplify the center and the entrance paths. And again, I used the grid. So you see there's this tile grid. And so I used that as my measurement. Same thing here. I used the grid of this floor to measure out a labyrinth, and I used squares, actually rectangles, in this example, and added some kind of sacred geometry to the center. So again, the rosette doesn't have to only be in the Chart labyrinth, it can be in other labyrinths, and you can kind of freehand. I just improvised this rosette, which kind of looks like an arrow pointing to the SF MoMA there. So this is on a rooftop in San Francisco. And I also had to work around these lights. So I was very conscious when I placed my lines that the lights ended up being on a line, not in a pathway. And here the light is actually on a turn, which is really ideal. I created this labyrinth at my parents' retirement community, and I had a canvas labyrinth. So here's an idea. If you have a permanent or a canvas labyrinth, that doesn't mean you can't create a second labyrinth out of tape or some other material, because this is at a retirement community and this canvas labyrinth has like 12-inch pathways, like 1 foot. So it's very narrow and it's an 11 circuit labyrinth. So for the people that had mobility challenges and were either with walkers or wheelchairs, I created this simple 3-circuit labyrinth with a 3-foot wide path, or I think it's a 2-foot wide pathway, so that there was options, so that this labyrinth could be used by the majority of the group, but then there was a second, simpler labyrinth for people to have a second option for greater accessibility. We were also worried about the walkers on the canvas anyways, just catching on the folds. Here's a labyrinth that I created on a tennis court just with tape. And I love this idea, but I haven't done it again. Instead of putting 1 roll of tape on my roller, I used 2 rolls of tape with a gap. And it created this double line, which I thought looked really cool. And again, this is the Chakra Vayu labyrinth. I'll show you a quick video of how to do this. You create a spiral, and then you open up the entrance and the turns. So this, I feel like, is the easiest method for creating a temporary labyrinth. It's the spiral to labyrinth conversion. Here is a labyrinth I made at Kripalu Yoga Institute in Massachusetts. And, there's a pole here. But I decided to put the pole in the center of the labyrinth, even though it wasn't in the center of the room. But that way it wasn't going to obstruct the pathways. And again, I did the concentric shape technique where I made a concentric rectangle, 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 and then I opened it up, and we actually turned the pole into like an altar space. So you can see we taped a labyrinth to it. We added a little table in front of it. And so the pole actually became something that augmented the labyrinth experience instead of took away from it. And as a labyrinth maker, you want to think about what is amplifying the labyrinth and what is distracting or creating obstacles in the labyrinth. And so you want to kind of minimize the distractions and obstacles, and you want to amplify the energy and the experience of the labyrinth as much as possible. This is a labyrinth I created for an art walk in my community, and I challenged myself to create a different design every art walk. I could have done the classical labyrinth every time, but I thought, I don't want to bore people. I want to excite them. I want them to show up into the community center and see a new labyrinth, that they've never seen before. So this is the Man in the Maze labyrinth. And I actually adapted it to divide it into 12 parts so that it would reflect a clock. And then I had a clock in the center because this was done on the summer solstice. This is the next time I was sharing the room with a knitting club. And they said, well, half of the room is going to be doing knitting and the other half is going to be the labyrinth. Well, you might divide the room, in 2 rectangles, but I actually divided it diagonally to create a triangle. And then the labyrinth was a triangular labyrinth instead of a square or rectangle labyrinth, which was pretty cool. And this is actually the layout of the center of the town. The center of the town has a triangular plaza, and the streets actually create triangles around this plaza in the town. Next, I did a Santa Rosa. So this is the same space, just different designs. Santa Rosa Labyrinth. Okay, so if you're working on grass or lawns, this is my favorite material. This is either flagging ribbon, and this is actually reflective holographic tape or ribbon. And what you use is you use landscape staples and you press them into the ground, and then you thread the landscape ribbon or holographic tape through the landscape staples, and then you can pound them in if you want with a rubber mallet. And you can see here I have a little table with some information. I have a bowl full of brochures and further information so they don't fly away. And then I put, well, actually my daughter put these pinwheels around the labyrinth at the entrance, around the perimeter, and then there's also a pinwheel in the center just to catch people's attention. So this is the material with flagging ribbon, which is very inexpensive. It's it's like $8 for 500 feet of flagging ribbon. So you can create like a Chart labyrinth with like 6 of these rolls of flagging ribbon. And this is a 11 circuit Chart labyrinth, full size at Kripalu Yoga Institute. And if you have 12 volunteers, you can actually lay out all 12 circles at the same time. So this is at Veriditas Labyrinth Summer School in Cayuga, North Carolina. And you can see each different participant is actually laying out one of the circles. And I was holding a measuring tape that was connected to a center stake. And the measuring tape goes all the way out to the perimeter. And so I would walk around the perimeter holding the measuring tape, and everybody would staple down their flagging ribbon in different, whenever I would stop, like every 3 feet I would walk forward 3 feet, I'd go down, and everybody would put a piece of ribbon down. And so we actually created these 12 circuits very quickly, like in the span of like 20 minutes or so. So this whole 11 circuit Chart labyrinth only took an hour to create. This is a labyrinth I made with rope at University of California, Santa Cruz. And instead of walking between the lines, this uses what's called the Ariadne thread version, where you follow the string. The string is actually the center. It's the guideline. And so you can either kind of tightrope walk it, or you can straddle it, or you can just always have it at your right or left. And you follow it through this winding path, and you get to the center. And this took one 500-foot long rope, and their mascot is the banana slug. So we kind of joked that this was the slug path labyrinth, that it looked like a a path a slug might take. And this is with Christmas lights. So this is a labyrinth I created for the winter solstice using Christmas lights in a double spiral. So you can make a labyrinth out of anything you have a lot of, whatever material, or, if you have a lot of grass, you can mow a labyrinth into it. This is a labyrinth that I spray painted the design, and then the landscaping people mowed it for me. And this again is the Ariadne thread approach, where you're creating the path, not the design. The design is the path. You're not walking between the lines. The line is the pathway. And that's the same thing here. Instead of this was for an art walk, and this was just covered in branches and leaves. And instead of creating the design, I created the pathway just by shoveling and pushing with my feet the leaves to open up the pathway, to create a design that kind of ended up looking like an eyeball, just because that was the shape that was there. You can do this on the beach too. I did this in Brazil. I dug out the pathway and then mounded the sand in between to form the 7-circuit labyrinth. This is my most ambitious, largest temporary labyrinth that I ever created. This is 170 feet wide. It's a double spiral processional labyrinth that winds its way around this wave and then comes to a sun labyrinth where you can then take this meandering path that looks like a sun rising out of the ocean. And what I liked about this is that you could enter this from the parking lot area, or you could enter it from the boardwalk kind of walking and bicycle path. And this was a more traditional labyrinth with, I mean, not traditional. This was a wider, accessible labyrinth, simpler labyrinth. And we had a beach wheelchair that people could use. You can actually see the wheelchair right there and the path of the wheelchair through the labyrinth. And then this is a more traditional labyrinth that you walk to the center and then you retrace your steps back out again. And what we did with the sun labyrinth is we had these little flags. These are called surveyor flags, and they're pretty inexpensive. They're like 10 cents each. And or maybe they're even, I guess you can get like 1,000 of them for $100. So I guess that's 10 cents each. And we used Sharpies and invited people to draw or write prayers, blessings, intentions on the labyrinth. And it really made, like, even kids that normally would just run through a labyrinth, they would sit down and they would write these like really sweet intentions and blessings. And they just spent so much time in the labyrinth, like in such a quiet way, you know, children writing little thoughts and prayers on the labyrinth. So very sweet. This is a labyrinth I made out of cornmeal for Earth Day at Reed College. And we didn't want to use flour. Flour sometimes can burn grass and leave a you know, a shadow of itself if you really wanted to leave no trace. And this labyrinth, we used this cornmeal, and we had little signs. Wisdom is a winding path. And in the center, there was a little tree that was growing. And again, we had people write kind of blessings or intentions or prayers on little cardboard paper and hang it on the tree, and then it would kind of flutter in the wind. And then the geese came and ate the labyrinth overnight. So by the next morning, the labyrinth had migrated away into another state. Which I love the idea that the labyrinth was ingested and went on a journey somewhere. So now I'd like to give Peter a little opportunity to share some of his projects and cue up the photos here. And
yes, this is quite recent. The idea of placing archetypal symbols in people's eye level in different locations. We have quite a rich tradition in the UK with people like Andy Goldsworthy of creating art in nature. And my morning walk on this occasion, I discovered that the one or two trees had been felled, and I thought that's just an invitation. So I decided that this was a good place for a classic labyrinth. And then that, many ways that idea grew, and I thought, well, yes, that was an opportunity, but maybe I could do some placing. And I was out walking and came across this pile of logs. This is in an area where timber is harvested, and I thought, this is just too good an opportunity. So I took along some PVA paint and decided I would start creating one or two labyrinths that would be seen by walkers through this particular pathway. Sometimes the logs are not necessarily inviting, but I wanted to create some kind of journey as it was close to a footpath. That idea of bringing labyrinths into the eye line in a way that's non-intrusive, you know, people are not going to object to this in the way that they might do with chalk on a pavement in their neighborhood. And that I've explored of late because it's quite a rich vein. Lars says using found objects. Well, yes, sometimes you can't necessarily find what you're looking for, but you can always go with a little tube of paint. This is in an area within 2 minutes of where I walk. And there's a fence around this. These are some that I will go out walking tomorrow, and I will carry some of these, and I will put them on the trail I walk and locate them in the forks of trees. And just, I'm never going to hear what people think about them, but it's a kind of placement and a sharing of the riches of these labyrinths here within a yew tree. But in this area, there's a big fence, a very large, secure fence. And I'm always intrigued by how you can weave things. This was me experimenting. What would they look like on my neighbor's wall? And I just stuck them there. One neighbor got so excited about this. She said, I could do with some of those on my wall. And she's interested in fair trade. So I created 3 symbols, and I was trying to engage with the narrative. This is, again, finding timber, as Lars would say, and weaving them into this fence and taking bark and tying them on and see how long it would last. Again, you can't walk it. Again, you can't walk it, but this was December, so we're in the darkest of months, and there's quite a lot of tinsel in our communities, but they tend to be inside. And I thought I could take tinsel and create a labyrinth for the people in the hotel on the other side, as well as the public park where I made it. And this, so I went round the back to make sure. It stayed for about 3 months, and I decided that the Christmas period was over and I would take it down. And therefore, I think you can explore ways in which you can create a conversation about labyrinths, and that enables you then to move from that, if you like, ephemeral to temporary to permanent, but also to engage with the narrative of the community. A defibrillator doesn't take any explaining, but why is it there? It's attached on the car park of a pub, the Derwent Arms. The Derwent is the river that I spoke of earlier. And this was put up by some young men who'd lost a very good friend who died of a heart disease that he didn't realize he had whilst on holiday. And they installed this defibrillator in his honor. And I thought, there's a narrative here. So I created these labyrinths, went to the landlord of the pub, and I said, I've got these heart-shaped labyrinths. I wonder if I can apply them to your wall. Yes, go ahead. And send us a photograph and we'll put it on our Facebook. Now, nobody's ever talked to me about this, but it's a kind of, if you like, the seeding. You throw away that seed, you've no idea whether or not it's going to take and what it might develop. And I think there has to be a kind of, with our expression of labyrinth, it has to be a generosity of spirit of often giving out without necessarily monitoring the anecdotal. This was a ritual, really. This was liturgical. With the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, I'd already been playing with ropes, washing lines, 15, 20 meters, inexpensive. And I was making them originally with plastic tops, again, re-emphasizing the need to recycle. And this one I created by just one night listening to a piece of music, and it would have been a very extensive piece of Orthodox liturgy in Ukraine. And I took these pieces of cloth, blue and yellow, cut them into pieces and created a prayer labyrinth, really, and then went out into the local woodland and placed it down and walked it. I didn't leave it for very long. But again, it's an expression of how do I engage with the world I'm in a prayerful manner, but at the same time utilizing the benefits of the labyrinth. And a friend picked up on this, and this was an Ash Wednesday service 3 years ago. We've done it every year since, and I created the processional labyrinth is well known, but I facilitated the laying of the labyrinth so that the participants in the Ash Wednesday service could enter, receive their ashing as part of the service, which included, of course, celebration of communion, and they would enter the labyrinth and leave by a different direction. Simple materials, scraps of cloth, old t-shirts. Those old t-shirts that Lars has got lying around his floor, they're ideal for it. Cut them up into pieces.
Yeah.
And this was when I was using plastic bottles and finding locations with an enormous sense of history. This was an area called Warren Percy, 10 miles from where I live, a church, St. Martin's, and a hugely historic site where there was a medieval village. So I would take along a rope laden with plastic, put it on the ground and invite people, if they were interested, to walk it and then pick it up and come home. This was the one I referred to. We used this labyrinth for the summer solstice. We're looking across the Vale of Pickering to where the sun rises, and this is about 4 a.m. British summertime. Very cold, but we did this for a number of years, again, with a local group of people who were interested in honouring the solstice. And they then said to me, can we do it for winter? This was an exercise which I was invited to participate in, and this one led from being a rope labyrinth to a mown labyrinth in Helmsley Walled Garden, which is part of the Royal Horticultural Garden. So the director said to me, would you do a workshop with the staff? Would you? So I did a workshop, and then the following week I went back and laid a labyrinth, and they mowed it into the grass. One of the delights of this is you have an ongoing relationship with a group of people. And a friend of mine said the polio vaccination program of Rotary involves the selling of the crocus bulbs to raise money for polio vaccination globally. And so I encouraged them to plant 4,000 crocus bulbs around the outside that would be planted, of course, in October or November, and then would flower in the spring. And she keeps telling me, you must come and see the crocus bulbs. They look wonderful. So you then start to create a relationship. And as a result, in the area I lived, I've created a trail, which is about, these are just the 2 towns I live in. If I said to you that all 5 of these labyrinths are different. So the one which is on now the bottom left-hand corner as you look, that is now in brick. The one in the middle of the page is painted onto a church car park. And if we then cross to the others, the one which says Castle Garden, a hugely historic site. You cannot put anything into the ground that is deeper than 4 inches. So we created a labyrinth, laying timber on the top and pegging it in. So it's permanent, but non-injurious to the historical ground. And then there's another one which is still in sawdust. 5 different labyrinths, 5 different materials, again, as part of the dialogue, and the map is the community where I live. Lars is now taking us to Spain, or is it Italy? I think this is Cadiz in Spain. When on holiday, I'm fascinated by the plazas, the huge areas, be it Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the opportunity to create a labyrinth using chalk, finding an old piece of plasterboard, of gesso, creating a labyrinth. And you know, as Lars said, if somebody comes along, you just say, it's part of my art project. And then the municipal cleaners will come through at night and they will wash it off and it's gone. But it enables you to have a voice within a community which otherwise perhaps, and this is in Malaga. There's a piece of sculpture outside of the museum, and I could just fit it into this piece of sculpture. Again, nobody ever said anything about me being impertinent or rude. Maybe because it's only chalk and it's going to disappear. This one is, I must tell you the story on this one. This is Cordoba. And I'd been there some years ago as part of an interfaith Cordoba with its deep history of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And I was going to this city, and a friend of mine told me the story about this particular building. When he was a baby born to a young woman in the village of nearby called Goat in Portuguese, in Spanish, he was given up as a child, and there used to be a drawer in that door where the mother would withdraw the wooden drawer, place the child in, and push it inside for the nuns to receive that child into care. The door has been changed, but when I talked to my friend Tom about it, I said, Tom, I'd like to put a labyrinth in front of the door where you were given up for adoption. And he said, this is the labyrinth, give me the design. The good story on this one is that in actual fact, some years later, his mother was able to go back to the orphanage and reclaim her son, Tom, who is a peer of mine, and raise him into maturity. And he became a Methodist minister, Spanish speaking, worked in Chile. But I put this labyrinth down here, and it was just fascinating, the deep sense of this is a place of great love, of great tension, of great pain, but also of redemption. And it was wonderful to see this young couple walking this and to engaging in something within a story that they will never know. So it's very small, but it's a powerful statement of how labyrinths get engaged with people's lives.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Peter. I love this idea of engaging the story of the place where you are creating a labyrinth.
I think so. I think context is important. And if you've lived, I was making mistakes 8-9 years ago because I was new to the neighborhood, and you don't know the pulse, but you kind of, if you can feel the pulse and you've got some ideas of how you could explore it, then that enables you to have a conversation about the existential reality of the people that you're working with, rather than it being just a crazy idea from an old guy.
Yeah. Well, and I love the idea too that the labyrinths are not ours, that they are something that we seed into the space, and they have a life of their own, and who they connect with or how they connect with people, often we never know. And it's such a great idea, and a lot of the classical labyrinth is actually drawn from the seed pattern. So for World Labyrinth Day, why not plant some new seeds, everyone around the world, and see where these labyrinths grow, and what stories they tell. So I'll show a couple more of my temporary labyrinths, and then I'll pass it back to you and do some more of yours. So yeah, great. Well, these are really inspiring. I think that's great. And that's one of the things that labyrinths can do is, temporary labyrinths are a way to really um, bring a labyrinth into a community, uh, ease into it. So, there's not a lot of investment in money or even in, that you just say, oh, it's art and it's temporary. And if you don't like it, well, maybe we can move it, or maybe we can use a different design or different material. And it allows you to create, as you said, more of an engagement with the community, a relationship. So. One of the ways that I used to practice my temporary labyrinths was for art walks. And, in an art walk, it's like every month or every quarter. And so some of my first experiences were creating them for an art walk in San Francisco. And I made this labyrinth out of shoes to represent migrants crossing the border. And I was a photographer at a high school, and we actually went to a refuge in Tijuana and asked them what could we donate to help the migrants, and they said shoes. So these are shoes that were donated by the families of the high school, and we used them for art installations, and then we took them to the refuge and donated them. So I created this shoe labyrinth on a sidewalk in San Francisco, and of course I didn't have any permission. And sure enough, who would come to visit the labyrinth but the police, because they were wondering what sort of shoe sale I was having. And I said, no, no, this is an artwork. And they said, well, you can't really block the sidewalk. You need to have space for someone to get around. So I changed my 3-circuit labyrinth into a little kind of 2-circuit spiral so that there was room that people could walk around. But then, of course, 10 minutes later, another policeman came by and said, no shoes on the ground. So then I just used chalk and I hung the shoes on this metal fence, which to me kind of represented the border fence. And underneath are large photocopies, black and white photocopies of photographs. And this is pretty inexpensive, 2 by 3 foot black and white photocopies to make an impact. So. But I use these shoes also in other installations. This is at an indoor community center, and it really drew people in, especially people that weren't familiar with labyrinths. They just spark their curiosity, and then they go on a journey, and you tell them it's about immigration, and suddenly there's kind of a real connection to the migrant story, in these objects. I had a book of my photographs of labyrinths that I had created, and I did a author talk. But I said, I can't just talk about labyrinths. People need to walk one. And so she said, well, that's great. I said, well, could I do one in chalk out in front of the bookstore? And she said, well, I have a lot of used books if you want to make a book labyrinth. And I said, oh my God, that's brilliant. Yeah, let's have a book labyrinth. And Lauren Arches actually came down and walked it with me, and I felt really honored to have her there walking this book labyrinth. And from that labyrinth, I got invited to create a temporary labyrinth for the San Francisco International Poetry Festival. And so this was a much grander labyrinth using volunteers to help lay the books. And I don't know if you can see, but in the center, there is actually a dining table with 4 chairs and a lamp. So when you got to the center of the labyrinth, you could actually sit at a table and read a book and, talk maybe with other people. And these are used books from the library that were actually part of their used book sale. But they said they sold more used books in the labyrinth than they ever did on any other day of the year. So it created not only a new way for people to experience the labyrinth, but also a new way for people to experience shopping for books, because titles would kind of jump out at them as they were meandering through the path. So often I say, you can make a labyrinth out of anything you have a lot of. So just, take a moment and think, well, what do I have laying around? And I was in Puerto Rico on vacation, and there was a lot of coconuts laying around. So I made this 3-circuit coconut labyrinth. when I went to Iona, I walked the labyrinth on the very southern tip of the island. But when I got to the northern tip of the island, I found this beautiful grassy knoll. But if you walk down onto the rocky sea bed down here, you turn around and you realize that this entire grassy knoll is a covered garbage dump. And all this garbage and bottles were falling into the ocean. So I pulled all these bottles out of the earth and tossed them up onto the knoll and made this bottle labyrinth, which, you could think about the message in the bottle, but also, this kind of duality of like Iona and Scotland, the sacredness, but also like the profane, the alcoholism and the drinking. And even in the news that time when I was there was a kind of a problem with alcohol in Glasgow that, some violence had happened. So I thought it was kind of interesting that this kind of intuitive process also kind of raised kind of an awareness about that issue in Scotland. I was invited to create a labyrinth for a fall festival, and originally it was going to be a pumpkin labyrinth, but he said, I only have about 200 pumpkins, but I have about 1,200 watermelon. I thought, 1,000 watermelon, let's go for it. So we created this enormous 120-foot watermelon labyrinth with a giant tower of um, hay bales in the center. So, it's just something I would never think. And this, again, from the sacred to the profane, this is my laundry. So in the pandemic, I created this labyrinth out of my laundry. And, there's kind of this quote that's like, after enlightenment, the dishes. It's like you have your heightened meditative moment, and then you get back to the banal everyday chore. And so this was to create like a labyrinth out of laundry, was kind of combining the everyday with the sacred moment. So again, just, as you're out and about, just see what's around you. I was in this park and there were all these redwood bark that had pulled off the trees after a storm. So I just, quickly did this spiral to labyrinth technique where I made a spiral out of the bark, and then I converted it into a chakra vayu labyrinth, which is a classical labyrinth with a spiral center. So it's an Indian Hindu labyrinth that is pretty old. So at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, they have a very, rigid structure about how the campus should look. And, they couldn't get approval for a permanent labyrinth, but they talked to the botanical gardens. The chaplain there, she talked to the botanical gardens on campus, and they said, well, we could make a labyrinth in the botanical gardens that was temporary. And so we created this labyrinth out of wood rounds, which these are branches of trees that have been chainsawed into like 6 to 12-inch height wood rounds. And so we formed this 5-circuit temporary labyrinth. And after 5 years, just as Peter's example, people loved the labyrinth so much that eventually they said, oh yeah, we'd love to have a permanent labyrinth on campus. So just a few more. This is a temporary labyrinth at the border of Tijuana, Mexico, by the border wall. And in Gotland, Sweden, in the ruins of an ancient medieval cathedral. This, I just took my foot and I dragged it in the gravel, and I was able to create a 7-circuit classical labyrinth from a seed pattern. And then this, in Chartres Cathedral, we have the Chartres Cathedral medieval labyrinth, but I thought, how fun would it be to walk a classical labyrinth in Chartres? So in the night, while the little light show was going on, I dragged my feet in the gravel in front of the cathedral, and I created a 7-circuit classical labyrinth. And then the next morning, I was able to go back and walk a classical labyrinth in Chartres, looking at the cathedral, which was pretty fun. If there's any advanced labyrinth people in the group, I thought this might be fun for you to attempt. Richard Feather Anderson, who was a guest in one of our Labyrinth summer schools, he said, you know, you can walk the classical labyrinth by using just the seed pattern. So you draw the seed pattern on the ground, and then I added the numbers to kind of help me. But basically, just with the seed pattern, you walk in one, out two, up and over, in three, out four, up and over, in five, out six, up and over, in seven, out eight, up and over, in nine, out 10, up and over, in 11, out 12, in 13, out 14, in 15, and then 16 is the center. And then you could retrace it counting backwards 16, 15, 14, 13. So if there's anybody that wants a challenge, this is kind of a fun exercise. So,
Lars, can you take us back to 2 days ago?
oh
To
yeah, the
the
last picture.
Yes, because I think this for me is an exciting venture. The people in the town of Selby got in touch with me. This is a town 30 miles from where I live. And this is an amphitheater which was never ever used. And they got in touch with me. So 2 days ago, we put this labyrinth down. This town will never be talking about World Labyrinth Day for a few years yet. But I put this down and it's got 3 turns. Selby has an old Benedictine abbey, beautiful, beautiful building. And within the narrative of that, there are 3 swans, which were important when the Benedictine monks traveled from Auxerre in France. And the river runs along the left-hand side, the River Ouse, and has a bend in it. And within the narrative of the city, 3 swans were of significance in the development of the religious life of this community. So it was obvious that I was going to try and incorporate 3 turns, 3 swans into the narrative. The swan in this area is a migratory bird, and we've lost them now to Iceland, where they will mate and return in the winter. So these long pathways were in many ways an attempt to express that migratory passage of so many bird visitors to Britain, but are harnessing the 3 swans as well. So as from Monday, the children will arrive with their coloured chalks and start colouring it. Already the local authority are saying, if you want to make it permanent, tell us how many meters of line we would need to paint. So I calculated 173 meters. The next day back came, that'll cost you £473. Wow, that's cheap. And hopefully that narrative again will emerge from, it was 2 people in the town itself who invited me, but I added the labyrinth to their desire. And I'm really looking forward to how that will develop next week, which is the start of the British Easter holiday.
Yeah, well, that's great. And labyrinths are about collaboration too, which is part of the reason I wanted to invite you as our special guest. So, you know, when you create a labyrinth, see who shows up and see who you can bring in that would offer a new perspective or a new idea, you know, to create your labyrinth.
Yeah. That's, if you like, on the outside. I was working in a prison, and those 2 areas are completely separate because one had the liberal opportunity to express these labyrinths, whereas in prison I was restricted by very, very tight regulations on security. But we developed ways of getting labyrinths in, and I would put one down in chalk in the chapel. I can't show the photograph. And eventually the governor said to me, one of the governors said to me, we noticed you've been putting paper labyrinths out. And it was this kind of thing, just on paper and putting them into cells, especially at the time of COVID. and the finger labyrinths using CDs, and that is just a tiny space, and I think Lars can bring up 3 or 4 of them, using a CD and putting onto a labyrinth onto an old CD and making sure that people were introduced to the labyrinth in a small area. So these are old CDs and printed labyrinths indicating where they come from, covered with a laminate of film so that they're hygienic. And these were put into the cells of the high security prison close to where I live and where I was working. So I suppose in many ways they are a different form. Again, we use them in the hospital too, as a way of trying to enable people to engage with the labyrinths. I think I should, oh, sorry, right. So I was invited to put some labyrinths down on exercise yards. Again, I'm not allowed to show you the photographs, but the exercise yard was such that I could only create a meandering path. So the governor, one of the governors said, we can reproduce that and you can put them into the cells. Obviously, on A wing, they never see what's on B wing, and C never sees what's on D wing, but you could use this particular meandering path on all of the wings. That's 500 prisoners had the opportunity to receive one of these. So that's been part of the process of working with labyrinths.
Yeah, and also I think another thing that you demonstrate is that you can work small, that you don't have to work, you know, on a huge labyrinth. If you're new to labyrinths and you just want to make something simple and basic, you know, it's as easy as making like a little symbolic.
Just as small as that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are other, you can create little temporary labyrinths that are just symbolic out in the world to kind of catch people's attention.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you so much, Lars. We're so lucky to have Lars and Peter with us with their amazing creative ideas of temporary labyrinths. And Ellen, did you want to say anything to close us out? We will.
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, we could stay on if there are questions too. That's for sure. But I don't know about you guys, but I'm trying to figure out where can I get sawdust? Where are some wooden pieces? I've got some CDs I could use. My mind is just rolling. So this was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Love getting the creative juices going along with the labyrinth. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Veriditas, also for hosting today's. And hope you guys remember the dates that we went over at the beginning, and you'll join us for the next few events and also for World Labyrinth Day.
Mary asked, can I do the beach labyrinth at a different time than 1? So we say walk as one at 1 p.m., you know, to create a rolling wave of peace around the globe. But if you're unable to walk at 1 p.m., you know, it's 1 p.m. somewhere. So you can, just like, you know, New Year's Eve with 6-year-olds, you can celebrate 1 p.m. in England and hold it in the East Coast. Or, you know, you might want to just, you know, figure out where 1 p.m. is, but you can walk anytime the whole weekend. So you can do it on Sunday, you can do it on Friday. You don't have to walk at 1 p.m. on Saturday, May 3rd.
Oh.
Don't let that be a limitation.
More important to walk.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well, great. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for being here. We'll look for you in the recording, and appreciate your support. Have a great World Labyrinth Day.
Thank you, everyone.
Very much.
All right,
Blessings.
bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.